Thank you very much, Julia. Hello, everyone. As Julia says, Mark Thirlwell, very nice to meet you. So at BSI, we're at the front edge of ensuring that AI is trustworthy and transparent, but also ethical. So it's great to be part of the panel today. Really interesting topic. We've got 35 minutes to sort out ethics in AI, so I'm sure we'll be able to crack that one easily.
Piece of cake.
But if anyone's going to do it, it's going to be this panel, because we've got some very excellent speakers today, so thank you for all joining us. So I will introduce them in turn. So first we have Lawrence Brooks. He's from Sheffield in the UK and Professor of Information Systems at Sheffield University, as well as being Visiting Professor of Technology and Social Responsibility at the De Montfort University. And finally, as if that's not enough, he's also an independent ethics expert for the European Commission. So welcome, Lawrence, please. Second is Virginia Dignam. Virginia's from Sweden. She's a professor in responsible artificial intelligence at the University of Umeå. So welcome, Virginia. Next is Dr. Chinuki Sirasena. So close. I had to practice and everything, not that you can tell. From London in the UK, who is head of data science at Zoopla and co-founder of the Deep Learning Computer Vision Practitioners Group. Welcome, Chinuki. Kobe Lines joins us from Melbourne, Australia, who's a visiting senior research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And last but certainly not least, Jonathan Salem-Baskin from Chicago, who is the president of Arcadia Communications Lab Agency and is an AI ethics evangelist at Spiritual Telegraph. And he's got a great T-shirt as well. Check it out later. So to set the scene a bit, Albert Einstein said relativity applies to physics and not ethics. Having said that, as Julia touched on earlier, I don't think anyone springs out of bed in the morning and thinks, I'm really unethical. Fantastic work. So it's obviously quite a subjective concept, but we need to make it more objective so that we can all play by the same rules. So that's what we want to discuss today. Just what are the mechanisms we can use to embed ethics within the creation and use of artificial intelligence? Now, the key thing this is to enable innovation, it's not to stifle it. If we are to innovate and use AI for good, it has to be ethical from the outset. I think of this as a bit of a model. If we think of the Earth, and there being three levels, it's similar to the sort of very traditional, not very sexy three lines of defense model from way back, but I think it equally applies here. So in this context, the crust of the Earth is the gaining consensus, guiding us, setting the true north of what ethics looks like, and that's academia, that's regulation, that's standard setting. We've then got the mantle of the Earth, which is that middle layer, which is really about how we embed it in the organization. So what do we do to turn that regulation and best practice into practice within the organization? And then a third is the people on the ground. So I'd like to approach it that way today and work through each of those layers, if that's okay. So before we start, I'd love to ask Lawrence, in your view, what do we mean by ethics? So very difficult question to ask in 2 minutes, but what is ethical practice and why is it important?
Thanks, Mark. So the first thing I would say is that I was going around some of the booths when I arrived at the workshop today, and actually it's really heartening to see that a number of the organizations there are talking about ethical principles, ethical practices within AI. So it's not just us saying ethics are important, it's other organizations out there that are saying this as well. I think one way of approaching this is to think about a set of questions we might want to ask of AI in terms of what it tells us about the ethics and the ethical principles and values that need to be embedded there. So we might want to think about the good old chestnuts of privacy and security, but also within AI, often is talked about things like bias, and also the concept of fairness. What's fair amongst different groups that might be impacted by the use of the AI? People also talk about things like human autonomy. The technology can be used in a way to nudge people. And how do we know what influences are being put upon us, and who's controlling those influences as well? And we can talk about things like moral agency and whether an AI is trustworthy. And again, there were a number of organizations that were talking about trustworthiness, but when you talk to them, they all have slightly different views on that. So I think one of the key things about ethics is it's quite a subtle concept, really, in that different people have different viewpoints. We can also think about things like transparency and explainability. People talk about AI needing to have a level of transparency. But what also you might want to think about is how much people have the ability to understand. So just saying, here's a particular algorithm, unless your audience has a level of knowledge and insight, then how useful is that? And then we can think about more kind of what you might call the darker side or the ethical aspects, is that we're assuming that everyone is using technology for the good, but actually people have talked about the malicious use of technology. And there are people out there who are using it for their own ends. And depending on what you think malicious is, there is a kind of dark underbelly to the use of these technologies as well.
Absolutely. Okay. And looking at that, so now we've got a bit of a view of, hopefully, a common description of what we mean by ethics in AI.
Not really.
No, I would also fundamentally disagree.
Okay, so
you go first.
So, Virginia, what's your view?
Why do we keep talking about ethics in AI and we don't talk, for instance, about ethical airplanes or ethical electricity centrals? AI is technology, are artifacts built by people, built by organizations, and managed and governed by those organizations. I think in a sense, and I have been in the field for far too long, also in the field of discussing ethics and responsibility and so on. But what I see nowadays is two things. One is that the concept of ethics has been hijacked by big tech and big corporations to sell ethics, and there are a whole bunch of people selling ethics in this event today. And on the other hand, it's kind of becoming a distraction for what we really need from technology. And those are two things. First is that the technology itself is reliable, and secondly, that we can trust the organizations around to be accountable for what they do. I suppose most of you arrived here today by car or using a car in some way. No, none of you would have come here by car if you knew that those cars had no brakes, and that if you knew that there were no agencies around that set up traffic rules, and also that make sure that the car companies put the brakes on those cars. So it's not about ethics of AI. AI has no ethics. AI is technology. It's about making sure that we are building technology with the brakes and the seat belts and the driver's license and the traffic rules and all those things, and at the same time that we have the organizations and the agencies that keep an eye and monitor and control and punish or award the right work. The discussion on ethics is really starting to be a distraction from what we really need to do.
So I agree that there is an element there of organizations and how they're approaching to AI. But to use your own analogy, in the early days of cars, it wasn't as safe as it is now. There was a lot of chaos. And if you go to other parts of the world, so for example, as an example, if you go to somewhere like India, the way that they drive, the way that they understand the rules of the road are actually quite different from maybe how Western Europe.
But that's fine.
So our global perspective on this means that we have to take a variety of viewpoints and understand we don't all have the same brakes or the same rules.
That's exactly what I'm saying. But the point is not to go talk about ethics, what's right or wrong, is assuming that we do need somehow to put those brakes and those traffic rules, that each one of us will have different understandings of that. But independent of the understandings, the point is that we need to have some monitoring in whatever way it is that guarantees the accountability of those that are there.
So clearly a lot of hot debate. Kobe, you were trying to come in.
It's so much more fun than having a boring a green panel. When cars first came into being, I think it's really worth having a look back at history. Every time a new technology comes into being, the technology companies have tried to control the narrative, to Virginia's point, and to say what should and shouldn't be done. Mm-hmm. And some may also already be familiar with the idea that jaywalking was actually an idea that was thought up by the car companies because they didn't want to have rules. Yep. They wanted to be able to have cars and drivers being supreme. And so they created this idea of if someone crosses a road and gets in the way of a car, well, that's their fault, right? And I think that's what we're seeing the equivalent of right now. I don't talk about a responsible toaster. I don't talk about a trustworthy toaster. I talk about a toolbox of things that govern, and I think it's also really dangerous to separate ethics from governance more broadly. I think it's a real, to Virginia's point, it's a real distraction because there are regulations that apply right now. If you are using AI in a company, you can't discriminate. You need to comply with human rights depending on where you live in the world. You also have to make sure that you're not breaking things in 100 different ways, including complying with corporate law, which then comes to the standards, which we've heard a lot about today already. The standards are also coming, which will hold directors of companies personally and severally liable for any systems that they use. And they will also make sure that the culture has to change. So although I also am concerned about the proliferation of AI ethics companies, because I do this for a living, and you cannot add a platform to a company and make AI ethical. It's not how it goes.
No.
Jonathan?
Yes, and I think the difference between AI and cars is that my autonomous car could decide to sell my stock portfolio at some point, or my light switch could decide to kill me.
People could build systems that do that.
I'm just saying the analogy to machines that are built to do a specific dedicated function, to compare AI to that technology is a false comparison. AI is a far more fundamentally empowered and empowering tool. I'm agreeing.
Define empowering.
Sorry,
I'm really
I
curious.
fully disagree with
Okay,
that.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
So the way AI is empowering is because it enables us as users to solve interesting problems or make our lives more convenient. The way AI is empowered is that the way it helps us is by doing things on our behalf or instead of us. So it's an interesting dichotomy, or if you will, two parts of an equation. What it's helping us do by doing it for us. So it's kind of a bit of a trade-off. My point being that when we talk about ethics, and I agree, ethics is not a dashboard. It's not a list of, I was in a presentation yesterday and heard the phrase change management. And if you remember that from consulting over the years and years, what the hell is change management? It's a box on a slide. It has no meaning, right? So the idea that we're going to program ethics into a machine, but I'm scared of the idea that there could be a generative tool that has the capacity to make decisions that will impact me. And it isn't just a question of does it do it efficiently. There is an ethical layer of is it doing it fairly and wisely and on our behalf, not just on the behalf of the capital the people who have the capital who own it.
Yeah, that's the point, is the capital who own it, is not the technology itself. The technology doesn't wake up, AI doesn't wake up tomorrow and decides to take over your portfolio management or
not
whatever.
Today.
It's
right.
the people that are behind the AI systems that we are using today, the organizations which can or cannot do that. AI doesn't go rogue. People using AI go rogue.
And I'd like to come back to how do we tangibly control that? So, Shanuki, we've talked about standards, we've talked about laws, we've talked about governance processes. In your view, for that sort of top layer, what is the balance between not coming in so hard that it completely stifles any innovation, but also addressing some of the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's about the people. The AI itself can't magically be good or bad. It's a piece of technology, and it's the people that decide how they're going to create products using that technology that decide on what they're creating and whether it's going to be ethical or not. And therefore, any business organization or any kind of organization, it's about the structure of how you set the people up that are making the products. So one thing that's really important is diversity, of course. And this is a real bugbear of mine because there's not enough diverse people actually coming into the AI workforce. Yep. And it really bothers me. Yep. And I actually have a hard time as well. So when I'm trying to hire into our, my data science team, I always get CVs primarily of white men. Yep. Some very lovely people, and that's great, but I don't know where everybody else is. Yeah. So I think we have a fundamental problem to solve is how do we even get more diverse people from diverse backgrounds even interested in wanting to learn about the subject to begin with, so that they can actually start, thinking of it as a career option actually coming in. So I think as practitioners, we have some responsibility to show that data science is actually fun, it's interesting. Lots of different kinds of people can work on this. Yep. So in an organization, so practical tip, you try to, of course, create a diverse workforce. Now, of course, practically speaking, if you don't have enough of a diverse workforce, then what do? Well, keep sharing your ideas with other people. You don't have to create this thing in a box, the data scientists are in this little studio and they're working by themselves. constantly expose it to people. Say, I'm building this. This is what I'm thinking about. Do you think it's a good idea? Engage with your customers, really get feedback, and that human in the loop is what's actually going to help you make sure that you're not accidentally. And I think most companies, they have very good intentions. These things happen by accident because they haven't got enough people giving feedback.
Yeah. So there's something about representation within the people actually developing AI.
Yeah.
What else can be done within that sort of ground layer on the roots level of to make sure that we are considering this from the outset?
So it's important to consider it from the get-go. So I think a lot of people, again, we think of it as a final product or when it's actually making a decision. Now, the problem is problems can come from the very beginning. So the moment you're even thinking about developing an AI product, you start thinking about what the unintended consequences can be, because a lot of the times the biases are coming in through the data. So they're coming in from the very beginning. And the problem is, like, if you didn't think about that, you're just collecting data going, oh, I'm just trying to get a POC up and I need to get this up fast, especially if you're a startup. You're always in pressure. You need to get it up fast. You're just using data and not really looking at it, creating a product, and then suddenly you realize, oh, wait a minute, this outcome is a bit, biased. What's going on here? And then you realize, oh no, I've got that data, all the way in the beginning, and then you have to go back and build it again. So what you want to do is to avoid that problem is to think about the data in advance. And I think, especially in startups, because of pressure, people don't do that early enough, and it actually hurts your product because it's hard to go back and rebuild something.
And it's inherently about trust.
It starts even before that.
You both need trust, both for investment in the product you're developing and also in the customers to buy it in the first place.
No, I think it starts before that. It starts with the question, is AI the best option here in this situation? And this is a question which is fundamental because that's where it starts. And it's a question that needs to be answered by a diverse enough group. It is a question that is typically not a question for which the technology people are equipped to answer. As technologists, as computer scientists, as AI developers, we know how to do it. We don't know how to ask why. And therefore, it is a question that really needs to be inclusive, to be multidisciplinary, to be multi-stakeholder, and to really ask also, should we use AI? Why should we use AI? What kind of grounds do we have before and then we can move on into data and the selecting of methods and things like that. But if this question is not asked, and if we jump right away into how are we going to implement this, we are missing a fundamental step in business.
So do you think there needs to be people that kind of bridge between the business side and the technical side?
Yes.
Because often the technologists don't
and between the society
speak well.
and the outside of the business and the business. So we need to have a much broader, diverse in terms of inclusion of the different people and different backgrounds, but also a diversity in terms of disciplines, in terms of stakeholders, in terms of commitment and legitimacy and understanding of the problem.
So that's what I did in my day job, in my previous role. Systems were acquired, they were built, they would come to our team, and we had a framework to review them. And my favourite story, my anecdote, was one of my first months on the job. I actually said, and I always start with, what's your problem statement? What is the problem that we're trying to solve right now? Because I can't review this product unless I know what you're trying to solve, because it may not be fit for purpose. And the stakeholder was adamant. This was an external consultant who I shall not name in this setting. And the thing they were selling just didn't make sense. I knew it didn't work. I'd worked in 2 data science schools and I knew that it was snake oil, but I gave them another chance. And I said, go away, write your problem statement and come back to me. A week later, we had another meeting and they had a beautiful slide deck with their logos. And the first slide said, problem statement, Kobe lines won't let us do what we want. And I think that sums up, for me, that sums up data ethics. And the role that I had was incredibly challenging because ultimately, data ethics, nobody's against fairness to the point that was made in the intro, but people are against cost in some ways. And so they're against cost, they're against challenging power. And if you stand up to a large consultant and say, you shouldn't really be doing this, or we don't think this is fit for purpose, or you know what, you could use this tiny little scalpel instead of a chainsaw, both for energy and data sources reasons, then you're not doing it properly. If you're not stopping things, you're not doing it properly, is my first point. The second point is I worked in 2 data science schools at 2 universities, and the culture is really, really toxic. So the first thing I did at the University of Melbourne was actually remove, and I don't know if people are familiar with this, all computer imaging is built on an original sin, which is the image that a couple of guys pulled out of a porn magazine, a Playboy magazine, of a nude woman. Her name's Lena. When I came to this school, this school in Australia, it was still a requirement if you were doing research, and I'm sure many of the universities here still do this, if you're doing research on computer recognition, that you had to have a reference to this paper. Why are we, and it's a really poor quality image. It was literally a Playboy magazine on a photocopier that was scanned. That it's used. It's terrible technically. There is no reason to use this. And women had to sit in these classes where this is the requirement in their courses. So to your point, being diverse is hard on all different levels to play at, because you're in a position where you're actually having conversations that challenge power, that challenge very old systems and structures, and you can't really do that when you're coming from that kind of cohort or that kind of culture that is completely homogenous.
Yeah, Jonathan, we're obviously talking a bit about trade-offs between that need to be considered as you're rolling any of these types of solution out, between speed to market, cost, should it be done in the first place? I know you're speaking to lots of organisations who are just embarking on this journey.
Yeah.
What are you hearing?
It's amazing what we're trying to accomplish here in building something that's nothing more than a car. It's interesting we have all these greater expectations for how companies will do it, but so the three things I think that from just a functional perspective, if you do care about ethics, one is to just merge your teams more earlier on in the conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've had a client who's come up, usually in the marketing space early on, and come up with, here's what we want to find out, and then it gets handed off to the data scientists, and they go build a model and try to figure out how to support it. Those people should be in the room really early on, and they should be talking to each other. The data scientists need to be forced to deal with the crazy, stupid reality of analog world where the other departments live, and those folks need to sit in on the data science meetings and learn more about what's going on the data front. That, in and of itself, functionally, will make them more aware of what they're doing, and more importantly, why they're doing it. It also, I think, mainstreaming AI and ethics also means leadership needs to talk more about what they're trying to accomplish with AI. It's a big bugaboo for me that we talk so much about the productivity and efficiency gains of AI, and they will implicitly require people to work less. And maybe that's a good thing, but if you're working at JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon has just announced that they're going to reduce the work week to 3.5 days a week, to me that says a third of us are going to be out of a job. And I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna and or say the sky's falling, but I think if we in organizations simply talk more about the impact of AI, I think there's an ethical question there about how it's going to transform businesses and communities. And it could be all for the better, but we don't talk enough about it. The second thing I think we need to do is build models that are smaller. I think our reach far exceeds our grasp in terms of what we're trying to do already with AI. And I think ethically, doing less with less is going to be more controllable and more manageable than trying to do more with more. So there's an ethics in design and building into the design of models and data sets that I think implicitly will be more responsible and more manageable and therefore perhaps more ethical. And the third thing, I just want to do a quick poll. How many people in the audience are practicing philosophers? Raise your hand. Okay, 1, 2, yes. How about theologians? How many practicing theologians are here? Okay, so it's interesting that we're at a conference and we're in a podium here talking about ethics, and probably to Virginia's point, it's not a technology conversation. There is no technology solution. There is no technology thing, AI ethics, separate from ethics. And it's fascinating to me that we're trying to distill ethics into a platform or a dashboard when we have, 3,000 years of debate and conversation about ethics? And I just wonder whether or not that conversations like this, instead of dismissing the premise of ethics in AI, could in fact use it as a prompt to get organizations to face more openly and more directly what do ethics mean. I run a communications consultancy, and I will tell you, every one of my clients has these highfalutin mission statements and visions and blah, 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 purpose and corporate, and it's all a bunch of hooey. And the idea that we might use the emergence of this new technology not to adopt some weird techno definition of what ethics are, because it's mostly compliance and efficiency, and instead use it as a prompt to talk about the ethics of what our businesses are doing and how we do them and do that business and why. And to me, that's very encouraging. And I don't have the answer, but it's not a technology question.
Yeah,
Definitely. And I think that one of the issues, going back to what you say about trade-offs, that's the issue. No one is against fairness. No one is against privacy. No one is against sustainability. No one is against safety. The point is that we need to put these things together. And we have usually in business and in technology work with limited resources. The question is not so much which ethics or how to put ethics or so on. I think if we talk about it from a business perspective, the question is, how are we going to do the trade-offs? How are we going to decide how much is accuracy worth with respect to sustainability? How much is fairness worth with respect to safety? How much is this? And I do these exercises with my students, and we talk about it. So you can increase 5% accuracy of your algorithms, which is in computer science the holy grail. Everything is about the efficiency and accuracy of your algorithms. And then I ask them, okay, but if this is going to cost you 10% more energy, if it's going to diminish the fairness of the algorithm by so much, how are we going to measure? And those are the questions that from a business perspective, and that is when we talk about business ethics or technology ethics, that's the stance that you can make. In our organization, we make these trade-offs transparently in this way or in that way. And that's what then makes the business differentiation and what makes the discussion being meaningful. Just keeping talking about what's right and wrong, it's not where
it's a bit too black and white.
Go.
Yeah. Lawrence, what's your views on how we go about making those trade-offs?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think you also need to start off by getting the computer science students to recognize ethics is a valid thing to talk about in the first place.
It's much easier to get them to talk than to get the philosophers to realize that they have a role to do in computer science. I have been doing that for 20 years now.
So I think
it's at the end. That's great.
about seeding those ideas and actually getting people to kind of recognize this. So we start with the first year computer science students, and I've done the kind of that intro lecture where they've sat in a room, 200 students, and they're going, we're here to learn how to program. And you go, well, let's talk about ethics. And they go, huh? Why are you doing that? And then you start trying to dig down a bit and say, well, hang on a minute, are you going to sit in the desert on a computer that's not connected to anything? You have to engage with the world. And yes, I agree, there are trade-offs, but people also need to take that premise from the beginning and understand that ethics is a concept that needs to be included and needs to be kind of put in there along with everything else.
Yeah. And back to what we talked about at the beginning of ethics needing to be defined in order to be understood, in order to be controlled.
By the way,
best we can.
When I talked to those companies at the beginning, I did ask a couple of them, what is your ethics model? You know, is it cost benefit or something like that? And they all said, oh no, we talk about security. And about the model, they didn't actually understand that. So I agree that those models, maybe we need to think about how we introduce them.
Right. Yeah. So go ahead. What I was going to say was, being AI regulatory lead at the British Standards Institution, I'm obviously very, very focused on the regulatory side and the standardization side. I'm a bit scared to ask this, but what role do you see playing in ethical AI?
So the new AI management standard will have built into it the requirement to do an AI impact assessment, which will require not just thinking about, but documenting the decisions that you're making so that it's actually traceable for the best practice. That's not to say every organisation will do it, but that will become best practice. That will also be required of your third-party providers, so watch out. You can't just contract with anyone because it doesn't matter how secure your data is. A lot of the current third parties are leaking and bleeding data, and that means not just looking at the contracts, because lawyers can sometimes get across the technology. Some lawyers are better than others in this space. But what I often saw was you'd have a contract that said one thing and an architectural diagram that said a different thing. So you also need to be reviewing your hardware, your software, all of the technical pieces as well as the legal pieces. But that requirement to take a stance on what decisions you're making is going to have to change a lot of businesses' processes, because when you do a privacy impact assessment at the moment, it's a one-off. You shelve it, you generally don't look at it again. With AI, every time you introduce new data, every time you repurpose a system, every time you retire a system and many other points in between, you're going to need to update your AI impact assessment. So I'm actually really surprised there aren't more businesses starting to build around that, because that's real. And I think that there actually needs to be a lot of work in that area.
Yeah, and that's for 2001, the standard you're talking about, for anyone who hasn't heard of it.
The issue, whatever you standardize, is not the ethics understanding. It's a very specific interpretation, contextualized to a specific sector, to a specific group of people, to a specific time, to a specific culture. That you can, sometimes with more or less effort, you can standardize the interpretation. You cannot then turn it around and say, because I standardize it in this way, therefore fairness is defined as I implemented it. There is this level of interpretation which you really need to be aware that we cannot really ignore. We cannot say that the way the ethics by design, the fairness by design as I implemented in this case is therefore the definition of fairness.
Absolutely.
This interpretation is a very crucial issue.
So with these standards, do you think we're focused on the wrong thing? Because we're totally focused on trying to make AI more ethical. Now, again, we spoke earlier, people are not ethical. People are the ones that are actually creating these problems. And in a business framework, what we need to try to convince people is that doing non-ethical things are harmful to your business. It affects your profit. If we can convince business people, and with proper research that backs this up, and there is already it's already been created, that when you're more ethical, you create better products, you create products that other people can use, many different people can use fairly, and that's actually better business. So what worries me is that we focus so much on AI standards. There's a lot of other unethical practices going in with other technologies. And you can make your AI models perfect, but then you've got this other model here that's very dodgy. And because we're completely narrow-minded, we're just focusing on the AI, when all the AI is doing is putting a mirror back on humanity and showing that people are the ones that are not being
But isn't that where management systems come in? Because it's basically those are the checks and balances in the organisation for how you do have that oversight. Jonathan's been trying to come in.
Yeah, no, I want to build on what you just said, because I think it goes beyond ethics being good business. I think ethics is good living. It's good behavior, period. And if your data scientist, if your developer, if your deployer doesn't have some internal moral code other than innovation at all costs, invention, whatever, and consequences be damned, we're doomed. We can't police what they do, no matter how great the institutional oversight might be. We'll be chasing the car, and we will, like a dog, and we'll never catch it. My philosophy friends in here, consequentialism is a fundamental concept, school of thought and philosophy. The idea is you're responsible for what you do. Wow, what an idea. It's totally alien to the concept of generative AI.
Yeah. But I think what you say is a very important issue that you say is this. It is a huge fallacy to think that ethics is against innovation. There is this idea, and people keep talking about it, we cannot regulate, we cannot talk about ethics because we need to innovate. If anything, ethics is the stepping stone for innovation, is the way forward in innovation. No one wants to innovate and getting down the drain or in the wrong side of history, if you want. So really, this discourse, I really cannot understand why people keep focusing on the discourse. Yes, great that you talk about ethics, but we need to innovate. No, you cannot innovate without really
Absolutely. I'm very conscious of time, and I would love to leave time for one question from the audience. Just very quickly to get one point in. You used the word police, and that does bring me back to the sort of three layers that we talked about earlier. So it will shock you to know I've never been arrested because I have an ethical set of rules by which I live. As to your point, Januka, I do it because it's the right thing to do. But that doesn't mean I don't want the police out there, would be my two penneth. Has anyone got one question? I promised Julia that we'd finish in time, and we've got nearly 3 minutes left. Has anyone got one question they'd like to ask the panel?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
One of the individual developments that are going to be the only consideration is going to be inadvertent linkages between developments. Take on some either for its own son to abuse it as overall frustration that we can't really control.
Do you want to say that, Kobe?
I think we can control them, to Virginia's point. We're making choices, but a lot of companies already have tech stacks that are interoperable. And I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned, which I'd love to get in here, is I think there needs to be a certification for data scientists. And there are some of us who are thinking about it. Doctors have it, lawyers have it. If you are building things, you really should have consistent training. Again, having worked in 2 universities, ethics is taught, but it's taught badly and inconsistently, so you don't have that culture. Maybe not at your university, it might be wonderful at yours, but in a
We're
lot
social
of
scientists, so of course we try and do it well.
but in a lot of universities it's not. And so I think, again, thinking of this as a toolbox, you need people who have systems thinking. You need people who are familiar with Nancy Leveson's work, who can come in and say, you know what, I'm not just looking at this piece on its own. I'm thinking about how that chatbot that sits on that tool, that sits on that platform, that's on Facebook, and everyone's being tracked with a pixel across multiple devices, does that sit with my business appetite for data sharing? And that is hard.
Lawrence?
I'd just extend that a little bit and say I'm out myself as a systems thinker, and what you need to do is you need to think about the whole system. You can't just look at those pieces in individual. You need to consider the ecosystem, whatever system that you're sitting within, and understand that when you have an effect on one piece, it will have these ripple effects, it will have knock-on effects, and you need to look at those relationships between the individual elements and understand that much more holistic way of understanding and thinking about the
this ecosystem is not a technology ecosystem. It's a social technical ecosystem, and we need to look as much as the technology and how the technology is built and used, as we need to look at the organizations, the people, the agencies, the institutions which form this ecosystem as well. And the control comes from there.
Chanuki, any
back to
final
change
thoughts?
management.
Any final thoughts before we close?
I just think we should aspire to just have a better world. I mean, as business leaders, let's do better. We have the power to do that, and we have the power to create the world we want in the future.
Perfect. And Jonathan, any closing remarks?
Hallelujah.
Thank you very much.
Can I just say, I think it's great that you've created a panel that, having said that there's a gender imbalance, that you have 3 women on here who clearly have very strong views, and I think we need more role models. As a middle-aged white bloke, I'm happy to say we need more role models of diversity in all its forms within the industry.
If
Absolutely.
it's about the good world, should be a world in which we don't need the role models anymore. We are equal enough to don't need the specific gender-based role models. That is the good world.
The world in which women on a panel becomes unremarkable and actually
Exactly.
As a shameless plug, if you'd like to hear more about AI standards, we're at stand B40, so come and see my BSI team. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much for a very lively, interesting debate. Thank you very much.